How's it? And welcome back to the workshop in the basement. I'm Conrad Davies, and today we're going to go on a ride. No. You're not going for a ride right now. What do you mean, no? Why not? We're 1 week away from Enduro2. We got to service this bike. Dude, seriously, why are you such a killjoy? All I want to do is ride, dude. If we don't service the bike now, we won't have time to test ride it before we go to France. Yeah, okay. Fine. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get that bike washed. Now, a really good clean is very important before you start a race service. For those of you paying attention, you'll realize that the bike that's being washed is actually the finished product because I've already put the chainring and the new drivetrain on. Before we talk about doing the race service, what exactly is a race service? Well, a race service is like a service you would do pre-race, hence the name. But sometimes it's more than a full service, like the kind of service that a shop would do. And sometimes it's a little bit less, depending on what race it is and the circumstances surrounding. So in my case, I service my bike quite often. So parts like my suspension get serviced really often, my wheels are trued all the time and things like that. So I don't really do wheel truing and that sort of stuff like you would do in a full service during a race service. But what I do in a race service is I will strip any part that hasn't been serviced recently down, and then obviously check that everything is in perfect condition to finish a race. Now, as I said, a full service and a race service are two different things, but in my case I did pretty much the entire content of a full service. In my mind, on a full suspension bike, if you do a full service, you can strip all the pivots, you're going to strip the suspension off, wheels off, cassette off, check everything. So the main thing is just to pull every single part apart, get all the bearings out, clean everything really well. So clean it while you're pulling it apart, so you don't have to mission when you're putting it back together. And then also you have time, if you clean stuff and check it while you're taking it apart, you'll have time to be able to check whether you need to buy new parts or if you need to do something specific during reassembly. So that's important. Probably pull the crank off and then pull the BB out as well, but in an e-bike obviously your BB is part of your motor. In my case, I know that the motor is in really good shape. I knew that everything was clean around it, so I cleaned it really well, but I didn't take the motor out of the bike. I did, however, check all the torque settings on all the bolts around the motor to make sure that it was properly in place. But otherwise, as you can see, every single part of the bike had to come off. Morning. We're back for round 2. Just to let you know, at this point, my GoPro destroyed all the footage from yesterday, so I don't have most of the build. That's why you've just seen some time-lapse and stuff like that. Sorry about that, but it is what it is. So I'm going to send Conrad off on a training ride. Yeah. Go and ride your bike now. I don't feel like riding, the weather's crap. Yes, I know it's crappy weather, it's fine. Yeah, put in some effort, okay? Otherwise you're not going to have any gain. Yeah, Dad, whatever. Now that he's off on a training ride, I can focus on fixing the bike. So now we're on to day 2. This process did take 3 days, but I had other stuff to do in between. First of all, it's time to put this fork back together. It's done pretty well, I must admit. I know I stripped it down to replace the air cartridge in December, I think. Since then I've done way more than 2,000 kilometers on the bike. Admittedly, most of that wasn't hardcore off-road riding, but I have been putting a couple of Ks into it. The fork oil came out relatively clean still, although it was full of water. You can actually see that the Teflon grease is still on the bottom over here, and it's relatively clean, it's not too bad. And just as a side note, when you have oil from your fork, don't just chuck it in the bin or down the drain or something like that. It needs to be disposed of properly. I put mine in an old ice cream container, and when it's relatively full, I take it off to an oil dump. reassembly is pretty straightforward on the RockShox Lyric. I always put a little bit of Judy butter or Teflon grease, depending on what fork I'm on, in the dust wipers, and then fill a vat with a little bit of oil and put those foam rings in before I reassemble everything. Obviously you need to get the fork slid back onto the stanchions clean. Then find the fork oil necessary for the fork. I always look on their website. Fill up a measuring cylinder with the correct amount of oil. Pour it into the lowers from the bottom before putting the bolts back in. Finalizing the reassembly. 2 bolts, 1 adjuster knob, forks back together. Forks finished. Putting this thing back together, so let's get to it. The first part of reassembling the frame is going to be to go through all the bearings in the frame and in the pivots, make sure that everything is smooth and greased. Here we go. Having the bike in little pieces gives you the option to really get inside all the nooks and crannies, which is obviously really important. And I'd just like to point out at this point that these bearings have had over 3,000 kilometers on them. Half of that was riding in winter in snow and rain and yeah, muck, and they're still perfect. The bike looked like it came with Teflon grease over all the bearings. I like to put a little bit of Motorex grease, the Grease 2000 from Motorex, around the bearing. It's a little bit water resistant, so it helps just to shrug off the water, but don't put too much on because it also attracts dirt and gets pretty grimy. Looks like the bike mechanic fairies have been hard at work last night. So now I've only got a little bit left to finish. So a couple of things happened last night. The fork's back on the bike, the handlebar's back on, the shock's back on, cranks and chainring are on, and the rear derailleur lock is on with the cabling in place. Let's have a look at something on the cranks quickly. For this we're going to need a torque wrench and a 5mm. The spec on Shimano's website says I need to torque my cranks to 12 to 14 Newton meters. So let's set it. When you tighten these cranks, tighten this inner bolt all the way to 14 Newton meters. Then tighten the outer bolt all the way to 14 Newton meters. And then make sure that you go back and check that the inner bolt is still set at 14 Newton meters. That's caught me out 1 or 2 times. And remember, put your tools back where they belong. And before you put your torque wrench away, make sure that you've wound the tension off the spring, because otherwise you're going to be buying a new torque wrench soon. But an important thing is to just check the mineral oil that's in the bike. In mineral oil brakes, because they can run at such a high temperature, they do collect a lot of sediment or a lot of that like dark soot inside the brakes. So it's a really good idea to give the brakes a complete bleed through every once in a while. And I did that for this. So I basically put brand new brake fluid in completely from top to bottom. Big part of reassembly was to just make sure that the sealant in the tires was topped up. Just a note to remember, if I was doing a race service for someone else, I would strip all the sealant out of their tires, clean them out entirely and put new sealant in, because you never know what sealants have been in there if they've been at a race or something like that, and 2 sealant brands don't mix very well. At a race, like I said, I've worked for the New Zealand Federation team and things like that. You basically have to make sure the bike is perfect on the bike stand, because the racer is going to take the bike from the bike stand, put it on the chairlift, get to the top of the hill and race down the hill. So you need to make sure everything works really, really well. So if you put a new chain on, you make sure that the gears are set perfectly. In my case, I get to go and take it for a test ride before I go and race it. Although I spent a lot of time making sure that everything's set correctly on the bike stand, I still do some final tweaks often out on the trail, or even once I've come back from my first test ride or my shakedown ride. Like I said, I like to take my bikes on a shakedown or test ride before any big event, and while I don't have the Les Arcs trails on my doorstep, I do have some pretty cool trails, so I try to ride them as hard as possible, check that everything's working on the bike really well, and go from there. Except for a little tuning of the gears, which I had to do after this ride, everything was actually perfect. So perfect, in fact, that even though it felt like I was riding a little slower than usual and wasn't really going for any high speed, I managed to beat my own time down the hill. In fact, I got the KOM on this segment. So there it is, fully serviced, ready to race in France. By the time you watch this video, I'll probably be on my way to France to race Enduro2 in Les Arcs. The Remote 160 will definitely hold together. It's a sick bike and it's definitely going to be fun to ride it there. So obviously the next videos will probably be about racing Enduro2 at Les Arcs in France. I hope that you got something out of this video. I hope that it was useful and that you learned something new. If you enjoyed the video, please smash that like button. Consider subscribing, and till next time, ride safe, have fun, and cheers.